Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Liz Delk, the Executive Director of the Illinois Stewardship Alliance. We're so happy to have you and very honored to have Laura with us today. She's going to talk about 5 steps to your whole farm climate resilience plan. And we were just talking, and she said, what I really appreciate about Laura is she's bringing to Soil Health Week a focus on small and mid-sized farms. And that is, that's our bread and butter. But we're really grateful to have her today to walk us through. So I'm going to give Laura the floor, and she can share her screen if needed. And I will be here. Laura, take it from there.
Okay, thank you, Liz. And we're a fairly small group today, so I do have some slides. I think I'd like to at least introduce this idea of the 5 steps of climate resilience planning, and then maybe I'll stop and we can just answer some questions if as you have them. And I do want to warn you that this is a pretty farmer focused. It's a farm management presentation, so it'll be a little different from my presentation on, well, a lot different from my presentation on Monday. So I guess I'll get started. So I have been working over the last 15 years or so to understand how or work with farmers and others, technical advice folks and others that support farmers, to figure out how we can apply resilience thinking science or resilience science into farm management. And so one ways that I've begun to do this, have been doing for the last 5 years or so, is I've adapted whole farm planning, which is a specific kind of farm management practice or approach to strategic planning in farm management, by integrating climate resilience concepts and language, just to bring climate resilience into a whole farm planning process. And I've been working on this most recently in the Hudson Valley, where I serve as the Director of Agriculture at the Glenwood Center for Regional Food and Farming in Cold Spring, which is the mid-Hudson Valley. And I'm doing this work within the context of Glenwood's mission, and we are working for the just transformation of regional food systems, of the national food system, into just, equitable, and resilient regional food systems. And we do that, we're working within the Hudson Valley food system, and our work expands beyond or extends beyond the Hudson Valley in many different ways. And what we're doing here in the Hudson Valley is working on developing these 4 strategies for food system transformation. And the first is to train farmers in diversified, regenerative, resilient agriculture. The second is to empower change makers throughout the food system. So not just farmers, not just eaters, but every stop that many foods make between the farm and the home. And empowering those leaders in every one of those sectors to help promote this transformation, this just transformation of the food system. The third strategy that we use is creating coalitions. And so our staff are particularly gifted at going into a particular part of the food system, the community that inhabits that part of the food system, to learn what is needed to promote this just transformation, and then to provide those the resources needed to help those leaders or those change makers make that happen. And then the last strategy that we're working hard on is working through how to be sure that local food is available to everyone no matter the economic circumstances. So we're really leaning into this idea of connecting farmers and eaters of all types to local food, so food access most generally. So I got into this work around thinking through how can farmers do something like a climate resilience plan, through my work over the last 10 years or so to understand how American agriculture can adapt to climate change. And I think the National Farmers Union said it best a few years ago in answer to this question: what does climate change mean for farmers? There were 3 bullets to their answer, and I think they really capture the full picture of what's possible in agriculture around climate change. And the first is that it's going to get more difficult and more expensive to grow food. The second is that climate stressors will strain relationships between farmers and communities. And so climate stressors just refer to the more variable and extreme weather, the changing weather patterns that are associated with climate change, but also all the knock-on effect from that weather. For example, after a flood, you may lose a bridge in a community that's particularly important to moving to people and goods moving around. So the climate stressors includes those knock-on effects from a specific weather event. And that's kind of the dark side of the climate change picture when we're thinking in food and farming. But there's also a light side, and that's that third bullet, which is that agricultural landscapes can be a source of climate change solutions. So a lot of my work has focused on addressing, thinking through, and developing techniques and tools and management approaches to help farmers and communities deal with those first 2 bullets, that dark side of climate, and then also to look for those solutions in practices and organizations of the food and how we can organize the food system to fully realize that light side, that agricultural landscapes can be a source of climate change solutions as well. And one way that I've been doing this is working with farmers around the country. I'm now in my 12th year of speaking with farmers to understand how climate change is affecting their operation, how they're adapting. And then one of the most important questions, it turns out, that I began asking 12 years ago was, how do farmers think about cultivating resilience on their farms? And so this is a very special group of producers. And they're special in several ways. First of all, they have been acknowledged either in their region or nationally that they're very good farmers. They've all been recognized within their communities or regionally or nationally as exemplary farmers. A second way they're different from all farmers in the US is that they are diversified farms. The language that I think captures most completely the diversity within this group of farmers is that they are all using ecological agriculture practices. So they may call themselves regenerative or organic or climate smart, biodynamic, carbon farmers, but what they're really doing when you take a look at their practices is using a fairly well-defined group of practices that are promoting healthy ecosystems on the farm. And the other part of those agroecology practices that are equally important to the success of these farms is that they're very intentionally cultivating positive community relationships. So they're also very involved with local and regional business, other local and regional businesses, and also a lot of direct marketing or direct wholesale. So there's that social side as well to their approach to farming and marketing. And then the third quality that also helps, particularly with questions about or thinking through with them about how they're adapted to climate change, is many of these farmers have been farming 20 years or more. And so that allows them to have that perspective that's needed for them to be able to talk about how weather has changed over the time that they've been farming. And in addition, a number of these farmers are farming on family land. Some of them are as many as fourth or fifth generation on the same land. And so they also can speak to changes in weather patterns because and how it's influencing their management decisions, not just from their own experience, but long family experience on that piece of land. So these farmers and this work with the farmers over the last 12 years have really, the work has taught me a lot. These farmers have taught me a lot. And so I want to share just a few of the lessons that I've learned in this work that directly relate to climate resilience planning. And so the first is what are some qualities of resilient farmers? And so the group of farmers I've worked with have taught me this, but also whatever lessons those farmers are teaching, I'm the kind of person that I go out to see what the researchers say, and is there research that confirms this? And so everything I will share with you about the qualities of resilient farmers has also been supported by other researchers as well. So what are these 10 qualities? And I'm sharing this today as a checklist, and all the farmers, or if you want to share this with other farmers that you know, it's a great way to kind of just check in with your own personal qualities as they relate to managing for resilience on your farm. So what are those 10 qualities? You do have to be able to produce profitable crops. So whatever that experience, that combination of sort of experience and access to markets and access to land and capital and all of the things that go into producing profitable crops, that's an important piece of resilience. The second is to have the skills to be able to identify resources and also to use them effectively. And so this is important to resilience because the changing weather patterns are calling all farmers into a mode of wondering how they might do things differently. And an important piece of answering that question is to be able to go out and understand how other farmers are using practices in new ways or using different practices to help them manage the increased risk and cost associated with farming in a changing climate. The third is to be willing to try different ways of doing things. So again, these times are calling farmers to be open to the idea that they might have to change what they're doing. And this could be anything from just changing some element of, for example, their soil management plan, but it also could be up to and including completely changing their product mix or their crop and livestock mix. The fourth is to have the ability to reframe problems and threats into lessons and opportunities. This is a critical piece as well, because the challenges associated with farming in a changing climate are such that there will be problems, there will be threats, there will be mistakes made. So very important to have this positive approach to learning by doing. Fifth is good communication skills. In good times, communication skills might not be so important, but when times get tough, really important to be able to communicate with staff, communicate with family, and manage the increased stress associated with challenging times. The sixth quality of a resilient farmer is to care for land and community. So not just care for the production process or the farm business, but to recognize that land is the basis of resilience, and so is community. And I'll dig into that a little more in just a minute. Some other qualities: they're able to ask for help and they're willing to help others. They have skills that allow them to cope in positive ways with loss and with change. They feel connected to others and a higher power. And in this case, the higher power may be a more traditional religion or faith community, but it could also mean many other ways that people connect with something that's bigger than themselves. For example, it could be nature. And then finally, that they're able to maintain a hopeful and positive outlook. So these are the 10 qualities of resilient farmers. And again, these qualities have been confirmed and supported by other research. A second lesson learned is that resilient farmers cultivate 3 kinds of resilience. So typically, when someone uses the word resilience, when the general public uses it, when the media uses the word, we're thinking about that bounce back. But if you don't remember anything else that I say today, remember this: resilience is about a whole lot more than bouncing back. And actually, the other qualities of resilience besides bouncing back are probably more important for us to think about in these times. So what are those 3 kinds of resilience? They can be described as the capacities, and they're complementary capacities. And all 3 of them are needed for a system like a farm or a family or a city. All 3 of them must be cultivated in order to promote resilience over time. First capacity is response capacity. And simply put, that is the ability to design and manage systems that are able to respond to disturbance in ways that avoid damage. So we never have to think about bouncing back because we are designing and managing systems that can absorb change without damage, or a shock or a disturbance without damage. And then the second capacity is recovery capacity. And that's this idea of bounce back that we all think of when we're thinking of resilience. And recovery capacity, actually, within resilience science, it's a little more than just bouncing back. It's actually design and management of a system to be able, when there is damage, to recover quickly and at low cost. So there's a little more involved in that than just simply bouncing back. And then the third capacity, which I think will serve us particularly well as we go forward with climate change, is transformation capacity. And this is the capacity to step back, recognize that the system you're managing is not performing well as conditions change, and making big changes in the design and management in order to enhance response and recovery capacity. So I failed to mention when I got started, I want to say now that all of the resilience thinking and resilience science concepts that I'm sharing today come out of a specific kind of resilience science, and it's social ecological resilience. And this type of resilience science is rooted in ecology and is specific to describing resilience in ecological systems that are dominated by humans. And so farms are a perfect example of an ecological system that is designed and managed by humans for a purpose. So 3 kinds of resilience, all 3 are important. Resilient farmers pay attention and make sure that they're making choices on their farms that are cultivating all three of these capacities. So the last concept I want to share is just that resilient farmers follow what I call the 3 rules of resilience. And the first rule is to cultivate diverse relationships of mutual benefit. So resilient farmers are always thinking not just about what crop to grow or how to get work done on their farm, but the relationships between the people and the crops and the land, and making decisions that are promoting mutually beneficial relationships on the farm. An example of this, a simple example of this, would be deciding to add to your crop rotation periods of cash crops that are perhaps growing nitrogen that the following cash crop needs in order to produce well. So that's a real simple example of a mutually beneficial relationship between a cash crop, a nitrogen fixing cash crop, and the following corn crop that needs nitrogen to grow. The second rule is to cultivate regional self-reliance. And simply put, what this means is that the farmer is looking out into the community and thinking about how to source materials that are needed from the region, to sell into markets that are supplying the region. And then the last piece of this that's a little trickier, particularly when we're thinking about climate change, is and also to produce waste. Any waste that are produced on the farm are processed in the region. We could dig into that if there's interest and we have time. It's a rich idea that I don't have time right now to give you that full picture. But another way to think about this role of regional self-reliance is to think about creating a food system that does not require any imports of energy or materials or export of food and waste. So not a simple rule to follow, but the farmers that I work with are using some version of this rule as they think through their design and management of their farms. And then the last rule is that to cultivate community-based wealth. And what does this mean? We're speaking more broadly, we're using a broader definition of wealth in this particular rule, not just financial wealth, but also the wide range of community-based resources that any community needs in order to sustain well-being over time. So that would include healthy natural resources, human resources, social resources, and also built or infrastructure or technological resources. So the third rule is that a farmer can also think about how they design and manage their farm to promote accumulation of community-based wealth in the region that they call home. So these are the 3 rules of resilience. And then the last is the last idea I want to share that these farmers have taught me, and I've already touched on it in the 3 rules, is that resilient farmers know that resilience is rooted in community. And the way I think about the way they're thinking is that the farm sits and the farm family sits in between the community, the surrounding community where that farm resides, and also the actual farm part of the land that is managed directly for farming. And this idea that farmers know resilience is rooted in community really just expresses the idea that resilient farmers, are thinking about their own land, how they're managing it, and looking to family to support that farm operation. And in this context, when I say family, I mean just anybody involved in the farm, that cares for the farm, that depends on the farm, that is involved in some way in farm decisions. So that farmer is standing in the family, looking inward to the farm and looking outward to the community. And as I've already said, it turns out that when you begin to dig into resilience, it's the community is every bit as creating relationships with community are as important as creating healthy relationships on the farm. Okay, so where does whole farm planning come in, and then whole farm climate resilience planning? So when you take this perspective of that the farmer must think about cultivating healthy relationships on the farm and also outward in the community, and when you take into account these three um, rules of resilience: develop mutually beneficial relationships, regional self-reliance, and accumulate community-based wealth. There's an approach to farm management that ticks all those boxes, and it's called whole farm planning. It's a type of adaptive management. It involves a set of steps. Some other names for this kind of management that are used in the business world, for example, is continuous improvement. And there are many other names for this approach, but they all take advantage of these 5 steps. Set goals, so you have a clear idea and you've expressed the goals, your reason in this case for farming. And these would be not just business goals, but family goals. And the second step is to assess your resources. So what resources do you have available to you in order to work towards those goals? The third is to make a plan and put it into action. The fourth step is to monitor performance of your plan. So you had a set of goals, you assembled the resources and put it into action. That fourth step is asking, how well is my plan working? Is it moving me towards my goals? And then the last step is adjusting those plans. If in that review of farm performance, you find that there's something you need to change in order to better move towards the direction of your goals, you can adjust those plans if needed. And I hope it didn't confuse you. I talked about 5 steps. The images that I've put here looks like just 4 steps, but you can see how they parse out. So we're lucky in the US in that we have actually 2 national organizations that both promote whole farm planning, a type of whole farm planning that is particularly relevant to resilience, and that's called holistic management. And the Savory Institute, you can learn more about holistic management from the Savory Institute. Savory Institute primarily supports livestock producers. You can also learn more about holistic management from the Holistic Management International, and they serve both livestock producers and crop producers. But I don't want to go into all the details here in this image, but I did want to give you a sense of the clear and very well-developed framework for decision making in holistic management, and that there are principles in this approach to farm management. There's a set of practices, and then within each practice, there's a lot of tools and ideas for how to achieve those principles. And the one practice I do want to point out, so that to connect to explain why holistic management connects so strongly with resilience. If you look at practice 3, you can see that that's a focus on ecosystem processes. And then you can see there are different ecosystem processes that are a focus of this kind of farm management. And it's there that the strongest relationship between this idea that we are managing for healthy ecosystems, for healthy social ecological systems, as the path to resilience. So there's really a lot here, and I just want to touch on it to let you, so that you understand where the management basis is for this 5 steps to climate resilience. And I think I'll stop here just for a minute and see if there are any questions. Does anybody want to talk about anything? And then I'll walk you through the 5 steps.
Actually, yes, I have a question.
Great.
Right at the top, you talked about profitability being absolutely bedrock, keystone, foundational, any word like that you like. And yet I know most farmers in America really rely on crop insurance. So are these farmers profitable just in what they do? So in other words, is there a way to build a business case about competitive advantage that they actually are successful businesses and conventional farms dependent on crop insurance really aren't?
Wow, well, that is a great question. Let's go have a beer later and talk about it. No, I'm teasing. Or your favorite, I should say your favorite beverage, and talk about it. No, I have a couple of responses to that. The first is that the profitability showed up as one of the characteristics of resilient farmers. So that's the first. It's not one of the rules of resilience necessarily, but it is a characteristic or quality that tends to be associated with resilient farm businesses. So profitability is important. But then you mentioned many farmers are dependent on insurance, crop insurance. But actually, I want to encourage you to rethink using that word many, because it's actually a very specific group of farmers, and there aren't that many crops that actually are eligible for federally subsidized crop insurance, which I'm guessing is really what you're referring to. Is that right?
That's right. And
Yeah.
I come from I was a correspondent at Business Week. So if you're gonna get a business question, and that's really what I'm interested in here.
That's fine. Yeah.
I really want to see all of this succeed brilliantly, because it just would be wonderful. But
yeah.
I keep coming into lots and lots of articles about why it's impossible to measure soil carbon, and they haven't seemed to come up with another proxy yet. We all know this is better, but I'm trying to find the metrics where it actually shows better.
I get it.
Finance is an area to really sort of drill into.
Yeah. And so what I can tell you is that I've been working in agricultural sustainability and sustainable cropping systems, farming systems for 30 years. And so what I can tell you is that from where I stand in all of this, I am seeing dramatic progress in making the business case for resilient agriculture within the existing economic system, which honestly is not resilient and puts massive barriers in place to resilience because of the short-term thinking that goes on, and because of the willingness to substitute, in the case of agriculture, I would say the willingness to substitute public subsidy for the resources needed to sustain agriculture over the long term. Is any of that making sense to you?
It makes sense. The argument that I've been or the threads that I've been pulling, and then I'll stop and listen some more.
Yeah.
Is that, if there was a proxy, a way to measure microbiodiversity, which I think is a really good indicator of the health of the land. if there was a way, well, not that, what you could, you really,
I'm sorry. I forgot that my face was on. Honestly, I forgot my face was on. Let me put my game face on here.
Okay, well, let me finish the thought. So what I'm looking at is that if carbon is difficult to measure, and it's not like atmospheric gases that you can say, and now the ozone layer is fixed. If this is much more difficult, then I'm looking for a proxy that I can use to tie into the value of land, the value of what they're doing.
Yeah.
And with that, to begin to build a business case saying, you should get a discount on capital. So whatever your farm loans are, if you're doing these practices and your land is looking like this, then the cost of capital should be less. You should get a break on property taxes. You should, if you have insurance, maybe it's a parametric policy, whatever it is, you should get a break on it.
Yep.
So that the money starts to line up in the right way.
Yeah. And so that's happening. Remember, I said there's been I'm seeing an acceleration of ideas like this, of things we need to do in order to be able to, within this economic system, place value on land stewardship, for example, right? And so I want to direct you, I have two specific references for you to check out if you don't know about them. And probably the best, fastest resource is that the Environmental Defense Fund. If you were to go to their Resilient Agriculture page, they have been doing some great research on the return, for example, on soil health practices, and they're doing thanks Liz, and they're doing on-farm research. It's very practical, it's expensive to do, and they have maintained a focus on getting this kind of work done. So that would be a first great stop for you, because it's all very much within the context of creating a business case. And their most recent research, I'll be honest, I haven't had time to actually dig into it, but the headlines are that they're showing that not so many years into using, let's call them regenerative practices, there's a reduction in insurance. What's the word for insurance? Well, let me get there. That'll be the second example, but indemnities paid out. These farms cost the insurance companies less.
I mean, what we're seeing with the insurance companies writ large, and you can certainly see this in Florida and other places that are really experiencing it, they're pulling out altogether.
Right. And that's also happening in the federally subsidized insurance world too. And I mean, so let me finish, and then I want to say one more thing about an indicator or a proxy for, resilience. So the second thing is the EDF just put out, the Environmental Defense Fund just put out a review of state, I believe it was, I'm pretty sure they were the ones that put this report out, a review of state programs that reduce the cost of borrowing, or there's exactly one of the examples you gave that are recognizing farmers using resilient practices, and they are reducing cost to those farmers.
That's great. So one last question. Is this video going to be available after the Zoom?
Yeah, we got the thumbs up from Liz, so I think it will be. And then the other thing you unfortunately or fortunately hit one of my buttons of particular professional interest, and that is proxies, or I would just call them, call them KPIs, you can call them measures, and how do we figure this out, and how do we actually evaluate the value of some of these practices. And I would just argue, my face, I apologize again, was just, I don't think the way to go is in some particular soil characteristic. And you should know I am a soil scientist. That's what I do. And I love soil. But I think it's the wrong way to go. I think we want some broader measures. And an example of one is stability of yield over time. That's actually something every farmer already measures.
I love that because it focuses on outcomes.
Exactly. Yeah. So Janet, if you want to catch up at some point and talk about this more, in particular, these measures of resilience or goodness or whatever value, however you want to describe it, I'd love to talk with you about that some more.
Absolutely. I know this really well in energy and buildings, but soil and agriculture, it's just the fulcrum, and you got to get it right. And what I'm reading doesn't. So you've been saying many smart things. I'm going to go be quiet now.
Okay.
Thank you
Well,
so much.
thank you. I appreciate it. Any other questions before we move along?
Laura, I had a question, and I joined a little bit late, so apologies if you kind of covered this in the first few minutes. But so you talked a lot about like the characteristics of a resilient farmer, and I feel like I spend a lot of my time trying to figure out how do we get farmers who aren't resilient farmers to become resilient farmers. And some of those things that you mentioned, I think that sometimes they're intrinsic, right? Like caring about other people and caring about community, or being open to change. But a lot of times those are kind of like learned things too. And so I'm curious if you, in kind of putting together this list of resilient farmers that you've worked with, if you also kind of explored like how did you gain these characteristics, and who did you talk to, and where did you go to kind of become the person that you are?
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't done that. I mean, I did that somewhat a little bit naturally so my research was case study research. So lots of conversations with these farmers over the years. I haven't done specifically asked that question, but others have. In fact, you're at American Farmland Trust. Talk to Gabrielle McNally. She did some award-winning research getting at exactly that question. A question related to, which is her PhD research was something along the line, was looking at the differences between farmers that adopted cover crops and farmers that chose not to, and getting into some of the kinds of questions that you're asking. Another resource, though, that might even be more useful is that the University of Delaware in 2020 put out a training manual for extension agents to teach resilient thinking, to teach resilient behaviors. And it is it is rooted in psychological resilience theory. It's not social ecological resilience theory, but it really leans into how do we help people gain the skills they need to be more resilient. Yeah. And then another place that is intersecting with my list and other work that's going on that's really ramped up in the last few years is helping farmers deal with grief and stress and mental health. So I think you can probably find I'm sure that some of that list of 10 shows up in that kind of work as well, because
No, thanks for those suggestions. And I work not too closely with Gabrielle, but we are having a lot of conversations at AFT about the role that mental health plays sort of in ag and farming, what our role is.
Yeah, and her PhD research is probably to her sort of in the back, in the rear view mirror at this point, but it's excellent. It's excellent work and really speaks to some of what you're asking about.
Great.
Okay, well, thanks. Well, maybe we better move on just so I can move you through these 5 steps and have a little more time for discussion too. Okay, wait a minute. That's not where I want to be. Sorry. I'm a little bit klutzy with this screen saving thing. Oh, I guess it is where I want. Oh, there it is. Yep. Okay, so what are these 5 steps? So just to remind you, I've developed this approach to climate resilience planning. It is based on holistic management, and it's based on whole farm planning. And so I've integrated into it resilience, the best lessons I learned from these farmers around cultivating resilience on their farms. So 5 steps to climate resilience. The 5 steps are, and these will sound familiar, what are your goals and resources? What is your climate risk? So that's a new step. It's what kinds of changing weather patterns. So climate risk is just the additional risk associated with more variable weather and extremes. The third step is to think through your adaptive strategy. So remember, I mentioned that resilience is about more than bouncing back. It's also about developing that ability to respond and the ability to completely transform your system when needed. And so that's the adaptive strategy bit. And then more traditional business management approaches, then that next step is to find the best fit option. So that's looking at feasibility, cost benefit, but also related to whole farm planning. After you go through those more standard business evaluation, option evaluation, you also then take a step back and look at how that option or that practice fits into your whole farm plan. And then the final step is to have a set of metrics that will help you judge farm performance after you make the change in order to evaluate how well that change is helping you get to your goals. So I just want to step through and give you examples, an example of using this approach. With my farm, the farm that I direct here in Hudson Valley in New York, and we're located in the mid-Hudson Valley near Cold Spring. So that first step is what are your farm goals and resources? And this connects to resilience, and I've already spoken about it several times because in holistic whole farm management, you are invited to think about the farm, the family, and the community, and to look inward to the farm and outward to community. It also turns out that having this putting attention on developing beneficial relationships in community is also important for understanding what resources are available to you as a farmer to promote resilience. The second question the second step is to ask, what is your climate risk? And so this will vary depending on your specific location, but I thought I'd share just some general climate risks that farmers all over the country, farmers and ranchers all over the country, and really communities as well, are experiencing as climate change becomes more intense. And the first is that water is a growing challenge all across our communities in every sector. And it's a growing challenge both in that it's too much and not enough, and sometimes in the same season, same month. So water too much and not enough, very common climate risk. Second is more variable temperatures and rainfalls, warmer winters and warmer nights. So what's going on there is that the coldest part of a day and the coldest parts of the year, or the coldest seasons, are warming the most, are increasing in temperature the most. More frequent and intense heat waves, so longer periods of hotter temperatures. And then they're not direct weather pattern changes, but all of the changes in weather I've mentioned already are also causing changes in pest and disease behavior, and also pollination fruiting. And so what's going on overall with these changes in weather is that it's creating more pest and disease pressures, and also disruptions in pollination and fruiting. So I just wanted to share the climate risks that we're working on in our farm here in Cold Spring. And we have about 250 acres here. We're a very typical farm for our part of the Hudson Valley. We have about a 6-acre certified organic. Are y'all seeing the flickering, or are you okay? Is it just does this look okay?
It looks okay to me.
Okay, great. There's a little bit of weird flickering going on. I think it's my computer. Okay, sorry. We are a 250-acre farm. We have a 7-acre, 6-acre certified, USDA certified organic diversified vegetable operation. And also about 120-acre animal welfare approved pastured livestock operation. And it's a diversified livestock operation. We raise beef and poultry, pork and sheep on our farm. So that's a real quick look. Most of our landscape is, we have 120 acres of pasture, as I said, and about 8 acres total in the vegetable operation. So water too much and not enough is absolutely our challenge here. And here's a few pictures. It's from the fall of 21, I think. I'm sorry, maybe you can see it, but it's covered. I think this is from 2021. And we've had a real challenge on our farm. It's a very hilly farm, and real challenge on our farm with managing more frequent and more intense heavy rains. And here are just a couple of examples. You can see we've had some pretty serious damage in our farm roads from runoff from the fields. And even in the fields, we've had some sheet erosion. That's that middle image. You can see after a heavy rain how water is just ponding in our pastures. That's that upper right image. And then this is from the an area at the veg farm, and you can see water just ponding in the rows in between the beds. So managing too much water is a huge issue here that we're beginning to work on. So this is an example of our climate risk at Glenwood Farm. And in just the next summer, we experience the most severe drought in the memory of folks that have been working on this farm for 20 or 25 years. And it was in general more from a historic context, a notable drought. And so you're seeing a picture. This is in August of last summer, and the landscape view. What I noticed, I noticed 3 different signals of extreme drought in this picture. And the first is in the foreground. That looks like maybe just to you a field that was prepared for planting. Maybe it's just been seeded, but it was actually a new pasture seeding, so perennial seeding that was put in the ground in May. And this is the August picture. So it's still not, we had not seen very much, even just certainly no emergence, but not even any germination in that new pasture seeding. So that's in that foreground of that top landscape picture. Look beyond, a little bit beyond, to the bright yellow pasture to the right. And you can see there's a structure in it, and that was our turkey. We have a pastured turkey enterprise, and you can see right below it, there's a close-up picture, but that was our pasture that we have the turkeys on. It had gone completely dormant. It was completely brown. There was nothing growing there at all. We had to start feeding hay last summer. And remember, we're a pasture-based livestock farm. We had to start feeding hay in early July as a result of this drought. So the last thing I notice when a signal of drought that I notice when I look at that landscape picture is the forests in the background, and you see those areas, those brown areas where the trees have gone dormant already in August. And again, that was something that folks that have been on this farm for quite a bit of time had never seen before. So one thing that we did in managing this exceptional drought, one benefit we had, I just want to point this out before we move on, is that we have, if you notice, in between the bare soil field and the turkey where we had our turkeys, you see there's all that kind of green area still, and we have quite a bit of what we call unmanaged thicket on the farm. And one thing that we were able to do with that thicket as a way to respond to the heat wave and the drought, so the heat and also just the lack of water, the general dryness, was that we moved some of our animals into those thickets and were able to put them in an area where it allowed a little bit of natural forage for them. It was a little bit cooler, and also those thickets, the reason they're still green is they're also a little bit wetter. And so this was a practice that had been used in other years at this farm, and so we were able to pull it out again and give it a try. And actually, given the severity of this drought, it was a welcome. Those animals really welcomed going into those thicket areas. They were cooler, a little bit wetter, and had some forage for them. Okay, so I just was describing kind of climate risks and showed you some pictures of the risks that we're focused on in our own climate resilience planning at Glenwood, which is too much and not enough water. The next step in the 5 steps is to then think about what is your adaptive strategy. And this is an idea that comes straight out of social ecological resilience theory, and I've worked to adapt it to farm management and this particular kind of whole farm planning. And so what is it? What is adaptive strategy? This is there are different ways that you can or that one can manage the design of or redesign of a system when they're under threat of disturbance or shock, including by changing weather patterns. And it's very helpful to think about making use of all 3 of these strategies, and they are roughly related to that response, recovery, transformation. Those 3 capacities of resilience, or 3 kinds of resilience that you want to be thinking about and making use of as you're developing a climate resilience plan. So in this particular context, you're thinking about adaptive strategies, and one way you can describe them is as protect strategies, which protect the existing farm from specific threats. So for example, a protect strategy might be add irrigation on a farm that's experiencing more drought, for example. So there'll be a specific practice that is targeting a specific kind of threat. And then there's a set of strategies that are called adapt strategies, in which you're actually making some changes to the ecology of the farm to enhance what's called functional and response diversity. So you see how this is getting into that idea of response capacity. And in that set of practices, you're required to change somewhat the species mix or the elements, the spatial elements on your farm. So there's just more change that's required to, as it says, the agroecosystem structure, function, and purpose. So there's a lot here, and I'm just brushing the surface, but there's a set of strategies. For example, you might, if your farm is experiencing more drought, an adapt strategy would be to enhance soil health. So to use some practices that improve soil health. And the reason that's helpful in drought is that healthy soils can capture more water in a heavy rain and store it between rains for crops to use. And then the third adaptive or bucket of practices a third kind of adaptive strategy is this transform strategy. And this is that transition or transformation to something completely new as a way to enhance response and recovery capacity. So there's a lot here. I think the main take home for you today is that there are a range of strategies that are possible, that they require increasing change in the mix of species and how the species are laid out on the land, and that resilient farmers use some mix of all three. The last thing I'll say is that typically in conventional agriculture, most of the time farmers are encouraged to use protect strategies. And that is one reason. You can dig into why it is that American agriculture requires so much subsidy by understanding that that is the kind of adaptive strategies that we promote in our food and farming policy. All right, and then the fourth step is best fit options. I've talked about this a little bit already, but this is basically standard feasibility study that any business is going to use when they're thinking about changing a practice, plus, you know, that standard feasibility plus, because then once a new practice that you've chosen to address that risk of drought, for example, once that passes all those tests, then you take a step back and look at that practice within the context of the whole farm and ask how that practice is. You can also, this is where the 3 rules of resilience come in, and you can ask how that practice is going to, does that practice help the whole farm meet those 3 rules of resilience, for example. And then the last step is farm performance. And remember, this is that step of just evaluating how well that practice worked. And there are lots of different systems of sustainable business indicators. Lots of lists that farmers can go to find what I think of as KPIs, sustainable farming KPIs, or key performance indicators. KPIs are particularly useful in this context because other farmers are managing, it's likely other farmers are measuring them as well. And so you can actually, sometimes you're able to find kind of benchmark values for these indicators, so that can help you judge how well your farm is doing compared to other farms. So I don't want to go into the details here either with this slide, except to say I'm happy to come back if we have time for that. But I just want to say that these are detailed. There are many kinds of indicator sets that are available to farmers who want to give this a try. So lots of detail, excellent resources for how to measure these things. And we've got a lot of good, farmers have a lot of good support if they're willing to take this step of monitoring. Okay, so just want to finish up by saying just a little more about this group of farmers and sharing their top resilience practices, and then we'll open up for some more questions. So as I said, I've been working with these farmers now for about 12 years. And also all of these practices, my findings have been supported by other research as well. But this group of farmers that I've been working with, here are when I asked them the question, how do you think about resilience and how do you cultivate resilience on your farm? And here's what they told me. Their number one practice is soil health, is maintaining soil health on their farm. I can answer questions about why that is. I mentioned it already, but it is incredibly important buffer for this too much and not enough water. The second is that they put a lot of emphasis on enhancing biodiversity, but it's not just throw it all out there and all the diversity you can do is the best, more is better. They are very focused on designing both the mix of crops and livestock and then how they are placed on the farm. And also these farmers think about their edges and they think about the whole farm landscape and how they all work together. So they are incredibly gifted systems thinkers and ecological thinkers. The third is that they tend to sell into diverse high-value markets. So just like they're looking for biological diversity or planning and managing biological diversity, they're managing market diversity. And so they're marketing to several different channels, and they are marketing in the highest value option within each of those challenges. So that's diverse high-value markets. This group of farmers, nearly all of them have had to work on improving water management on their farms, and this includes not just adding irrigation, but also adding drainage. Many of them have moved to adding more physical protection on their farms. So these are either hoop houses or row covers or some kind of protection for their crops, but also even just for soil. Protection from this more intense rainfall and more frequent heavy rainfalls. And then finally, the last very common resilience practice is that these farmers speak, over the years I've been working with them, about putting more and more emphasis on having reserves and recovery. It's better, more savings so that they can recover. Remember I said that recovery capacity in resilience is about recovering swiftly and at low cost. And so they're putting into place more savings, access to credit, but they're also putting into place additional feed reserves, additional water reserves, the ability to produce power on their farms. So lots of different kinds of recovery reserves are becoming more and more important to these farmers. And that makes sense as climate change impacts are becoming more frequent and more intense on farms. So I will stop right there and see if we have any other questions, and then I'll end by giving you a few resources to continue digging into this 5 steps approach. In fact, I'll throw those in the chat right now, and you can think about what questions you have for me.
Oh, I always have questions.
I have a question too, whenever you're ready to hear it.
Why don't you start, Allison? Because I took up a lot of time earlier.
Oh,
awesome. I'd be happy to start. So a lot of the farmers that I'm talking to up here in the state line region are talking a lot about how regionally part of the way that we are experiencing climate impact is going to be to just like ramp up our production a lot, because we're lucky to be having climate impacts that are very, like, it's very easy for us to adapt to them, as opposed to like wildfire impacts. So like regionally, I think that what's on a lot of our minds is thinking about scaling up our production and having better like farm customer community relationships. But it seems like a lot of planning for those adaptations really must be done in community. Like I can't solo plan those kinds of adaptations. So I was wondering if you had any advice about like how to go about facilitating this kind of planning process in collaboration with a multi-farm group, or like in some sort of more collaborative way to address those bigger goals.
Yes, great question. I offer climate resilience planning workshops, and I partner with local or regional farming organizations to do that. It's not really getting at your question though. What I would say is that remember that part of the 5 steps process is doing that look out to, well, thinking about resources, that first step, goals and resources. So an individual farmer could or will decide on goals for the farm business, and then that other part is to look at your resources. And so there you're looking inward at the farm and outward to the community. And so the first step, I would say, and I've created a 5 steps guide, and I had all the links ready for you, but I just put them in the chat and all the links are gone. So I'll figure something out. Maybe Liz can help me just follow up email to everyone with the links. But at any rate, I've created a little 5 steps guide. It's free. You can download it, and you can get all the details about this. But one of the practices that are included in that guide that's relevant to your question is go out and figure out who is doing resilience planning and engage with them. And that's could be a heavy lift for an individual farmer, but that's where you engage a local or regional ag organization rep, and you get somebody to get that stuff for you. Some of the other practices that are equally important, because remember, a resilient farmer is going to be cultivating relationship, right? Is get involved. Find out what kind of local disaster planning is going on in your community. Get involved. Just do something, one weekend, just to get to know those folks, and so on. And one of the things that I know is true, because I've led these climate resilient planning workshops around the country now, is that very often when farmers take that step, or their supporter takes that step, it's really inspiring for everybody, because you don't even know what's actually going on. And it feels very hopeful when you do finally take a look to realize that there are people doing resilience planning. And, the thing that I've found related to that is that very often food and farming are not included. But then that's an opportunity for leadership, right? And to get that conversation started. And in many places, food sometimes is included, and occasionally farming is included too. But does that answer your question? So that's how you would begin to think about, you can do it as an individual farmer, take a look out there, see what's going on. And then beyond that, I would recommend that rather than the farmers trying to create a network to do this thing, you just ask for what you need from the organizations that are already doing it. Does that make sense? I'm sorry, I may have lost the thread of your question and all of that.
That's really helpful. Part of the reason why I'm asking is that I'm kind of in a good position to be the one asking for this to our local sustainability organizations. Like, for example, I sit on the steering committee of our region's craft network. And I work for Angelic Organics Learning Center, which does some farmer training related work. That's one of our departments. I'm on the board of our city's sustainability organization, and I'm bringing
yeah.
the food and
Yeah.
agriculture perspective to that organization, kicking and screaming.
Yeah.
So I think that like what I'm proud of as I'm listening to you talk, what I'm proud of for myself is that I think that I'm doing this work around the community building piece. I think I'm on a good path there, and I want to leverage the work that I've already done so far to get at this question of how do we specifically build a farming system that will be resilient to the increased demand on our regional farming system.
Yes, and so thank you for that additional context for your work. And so you're one of those, when I said, partner with a local organization and get them to do the groundwork, because many farmers just don't have time to do that, or can't make it a priority,
Mm-hmm.
So you're exactly the kind of person I'm imagining that could take something like this forward. So that's great. That sounds like you're already doing that work. So thank you for that work.
Yeah, I can't wait to look at these resources that are coming my way, because I think that that's going to be exactly the information I need for organizing my thoughts about next steps.
Yeah, and so I did get one link together, and I'm putting it in the chat now, and that's the 5 Steps Guide. And the 5 Steps Guide, actually, I remembered I had set up a whole bunch of links to send to y'all, but the 5 Steps Guide actually has active links in it. It's a PDF and it has active links, so you can find all the other recommended resources.
Thank you so much.
So yeah, but please follow up if you want directly, and I'd be happy to have another chat with you to get you going on that work. That's great.
Thanks.
Well, from my experience, we need farmers, eaters, everybody in the food system. We need more people engaged in resilience planning, community resilience planning, because it's a huge gap in many communities. So the more we can all do that, the better.
Absolutely.
So my quick question is, you talked about extreme flood, extreme water, and then drought. Are you seeing the pattern of how we're experiencing climate change is more frequent swings? So in other words, not a steady, we're a warming climate that you can kind of prepare for, but rather a system so out of balance that it's going from one extreme to the other more rapidly than it used to do, and in more extreme ways than it used to do?
The way I'd answer that question is that we're seeing more frequent and intense extreme events. We're also seeing more erratic weather, and I wouldn't necessarily connect it to a system so out of balance. I mean, that's the piece. I'm not a climate scientist. I've learned a lot in the last 15 years or so. But when I speak to climate scientists, the way they describe what's driving the changing weather patterns is that there's just more energy in the atmosphere. Or I think that's what they say.
Well,
yeah,
what they're saying is when you have a warmer world, you have more water vapor.
Well,
and
they say that, yeah, but there's also more energy, so storms are more intense. That's why we're getting the heavier rains, for example, and because there's more water in the atmosphere. But I'm not sure what is when you're asking that question, what do you want to do with that extremes?
Well, what I'm trying to figure out is, if you have an issue where climate change is something that you're farming in one area, and then really you can adapt for farming in a different area, that there's some stability. But when you have wide variations over a short amount of time, it really throws a wrench in the works of planning.
Oh, yeah, okay, I understand what you're saying. Yes. In general, climate change, the effects of climate change in agriculture are so difficult because it is just increasing uncertainty around weather tremendously. And then some of the weather effects are particularly tough for crops and livestock to deal with. And one of them is, you mentioned it, an extreme shift, particularly in temperatures over a very short time frame. Really tough for plants and animals to handle. So yes, the nature of climate risk is it is challenging, seriously challenging traditional agriculture risk management. Am I getting where you were kind of
No,
thinking?
you're absolutely getting to it, because I think there's a common sort of thought among people who aren't, I'm the non-farmer in the call here, that the climate is warming and that it's happening, but that you can somehow prepare for it and predict for it. And it's like you're going straight into an asteroid belt.
Yeah, I mean, from my own perspective, what I hear a lot is that, oh, farmers have always had to manage weather. This is nothing new. And that's just absolutely wrong. It is new. And they've never had to. No farmer ever, actually, if you take a look at the data, no farmer ever in the history of agriculture, talking 5,000 years now, or 10, depending on where you put that, no farmer ever in the history of agriculture has had to manage this level of variability and intensity.
So when we're talking about climate change and the threat,
yeah,
the
let me
change,
let me finish my thought.
Okay.
So one is, it is something new, and the second is that that it's not some new normal that we're getting to and we just have to adjust to it. And one way that I've heard this described is it is a moving target. And so there are these two levels of uncertainty coming into the ag-risk management picture. And ag-risk management, traditional ag-risk management, absolutely unsuited to dealing with either one of these two levels. And then there's a third level, which is all the knock-on effects, which I've mentioned several times. You know, it's not just about weather, it's about how pests and diseases are changing, and so on and so on. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but that was the full answer to what my answer to what you were asking.
See, I think that is really a critical point that hasn't gotten out. That, you know, we talk about climate change, and most people lean into the climate part of that thing, but the change and the rate of change, you're talking not just about needing resilience, but dynamic resilience.
Well, yeah, that is what resilience is. So you know, I served as a lead author on a 2013 USDA report adapting U.S. agriculture to climate change. And that report, one of the major findings was that we needed a new way to manage risk, because the kind of risk we were heading into at that time was something novel. And so we needed to think about changing risk management in agriculture. So it's not just me.
Well, the last thing that I will tell you is that there is a word, it's a horrible word, but it became the it word at the World Economic Forum meeting at Davos this year, which is polycrisis, which is the idea that it isn't one crisis, but it is several. And I've been writing for years that the tipping points aren't just tipping, but they're colliding. And this is basically what you're telling me. So I think that's a really important point as you're beginning to explain this to people who aren't right there going, what the hell, but people who are one step back trying to figure out how is this affecting agriculture.
Yeah, and I just want to thank you, Russell, for wading into this conversation. Russell's a farmer and says, I've always managed for weather. What is different now is the level of management and the extremes associated with it. And yes, I wasn't at all suggesting that farmers didn't manage for weather before, But this idea that it's somehow nothing new, which I hear in my work, I think it is something new. And I think Russell points out what's different. What is new is the level of management required and the level of extremes associated with it. And as I understand it, Russell, this is just going to continue to get more difficult. So the level of management will have to increase even more, and the level of extremes will increase even more. So sorry to be the bearer of that particular bad news, but the good news is that there really is there's I've been doing this now about 15 years, and I am seeing, as I said earlier, I'm seeing a sea change in how governments and business are thinking about, and nonprofit organizations working with agriculture and food. There's been a real sea change in one way I see it is, or one way I can talk about it is, there's been a maturing of response to the level of challenge that this presents, or just a more acknowledging and recognizing, a recognition that these are new days, and it's going to require that we change the way we do things in agriculture. And that's all to the good. That's all to the good, because we all need that help.
See, I would, again, journalist background, pulling the strings in, is that the farmers who have a toolbox of resilience strategies are prepared to survive, maybe thrive, but survive. And the ones that are sort of addicted to crop insurance, more conventional farmers, more whatever, one good extreme weather event can knock them off. So, there's that idea of a seed bank, things that will grow, that we're just waiting for the right moment. And I think, in a way, what I'm seeing or hearing here is a seed bank of knowledge.
Yes, and actually we have deep knowledge, because there are a lot of practices that fit into. Hey, Liz, would you be able to quickly find the SARE bulletin link? It's called Cultivating Resilience on Farms and Ranches, and get that in there. I know we're getting long. We need to stop, but if you can find that, that would be great. It turns out, as I dug into all of this and thought about climate resilience planning, that I do think of the farmers I've been working with over the last decade. They have what I call a climate resilience toolbox. And it turns out, and this is really good news, there are a lot of very commonly used practices already used on farms and ranches all over this country that are in that toolbox. And then there's some new tools that we can certainly add to that toolbox. It's not really about changing the tools of farming. It's about changing the thinking, the approach to managing risk. That's what is required to change. Did you get that? Yeah. And so that Cultivating Resilience bulletin, it's a Sustainable Ag Research and Education program bulletin. It's a free download, and it lays out this challenge of climate risk, and it also lays out the thinking for how we need to think differently about on our farms. The last thing I want to say is, you mentioned, the farmers that are taking advantage of subsidized insurance. I would frame it a little differently than you did. And I would say that given their production systems, they are making use of all the tools of resilience that are available to them. And it's actually smart farming. And yes, you're right. When you subsidize a farm to use practices that do not improve soil health, you are essentially, the word for it in resilience thinking is fragile. So what our policy has been doing is subsidizing fragility on the farm. And my own thinking is that our policies, we need to shift our policies to subsidize resilience. I mean, it's an easy thing to say. I recognize it's a very difficult thing to do. But that's what we need to do. And I don't think it's a good option. I don't think we want to be pointing fingers at any particular farmer and saying they're addicted to something. I think that every farmer, every farm is a unique system, and that the best farmers are looking out at what resources are available to sustain their farm over time. And some farms right now, or have for the last 30 years, had benefit of subsidized insurance. And so they used it. Well, that's smart. Where we have to go as a in public policy is to recognize that over the long term, that's a really bad approach to promoting resilience in the farming sector. And we need to come up with some new approaches. And there's a lot of organizations working on what those new approaches look like, including the great research being done right now by the Environmental Defense Fund on, you know, the payback and the public benefit of resilient farming practices. So I realize I just went long there. Sorry, Liz. And thank you, Janet and Allison and Russell, for a great conversation.
Thank you. It was great.
Thank you so much. I'm so lucky to have your work.
Thanks.
Well, Laura, would you be willing to share your slide deck? Maybe you could, if you're willing to share it, send me an email and I'll share it with the participants. Thank you all for coming. You'll get a recording, and I also have a transcript of this, so I will share all of that with all of you. And Laura, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate the invitation. Bye-bye now.
Well, that's nice.